Are you wondering how to break the stigma around mental health issues and the impact that it's having on our African American and other disenfranchised communities? If you are, join us, your hosts, Marincia Henson, Lucretia Lee, and Walanda Johnson on our Mindful Moments mental health radio show every second and fourth Thursday of every month at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, as we dive into a mindful dialogue to empower, inform, and bring awareness to the positive impact of mental health wellness.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am one of your hosts, Marincia Henson. Thank you so much for coming on and joining us once again on this Thursday evening. So we really appreciate your time. Again, my name is Marincia Henson. I am an associate clinical social worker here in San Diego. I work with children, adolescents, and adults that have intellectual disabilities such as autism, as well as mental health disorders. And we also have Lucretia Lee.
Hello, everybody. I'm Lucretia Lee. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I work at one of the local detention facilities, which is jail. And I assess for suicide ideation. And what that means is I'm assessing for thoughts of suicide all the way to a plan. And the goal is to make sure that while they are incarcerated, that they're put into a module where they're going to be most safe.
And I am the third person of the triad, Walanda Johnson. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I practice telehealth in the state of California, providing mental health to adults who are struggling with anxiety, life issues, women issues, relationship stress, and things like that.
Thank you. So once again, this evening, you will have a mindful moment to discuss, as well as enlighten, educate, and bring awareness to the topic of sex trafficking. This evening, though, we have an amazing guest, Dr. Candace Hodge. A little bit about her. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at Azusa Pacific University. Dr. Hodge's background spans the field of sociology, African American studies, psychology, and criminal justice. Her current interest is in advancing an evidence-based approach in the development of school policy that addresses interpersonal violence on college and university campuses, drawing on a broad range of experience, including research on the intersectionality of race, class, gender, STDs, and HIV among communities of color and victimology. Dr. Hodge has a passion of addressing injustice that are affecting a variety of different communities. She received her BA in sociology as well as African American studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She also received her master's degree in sociology at California State University of Fullerton. And she also received her doctorate degree in sociology and criminal justice at Howard University. She's my HU sister, so I'm so excited to have her on this evening as our guest.
Yes, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And so after that introduction, I have nothing else to say. I am excited about the topic that we're going to cover tonight, not necessarily because of the name of the topic, because the nature of it is very egregious as it relates to who has been impacted, but just the fact that we are educating our community, we are making people aware of this topic, and then figuring out how we as individuals and professionals can really address this issue moving forward. So thank you to the panelists that is on here. I'm really excited for this back and forth dialogue, and I'm excited to see what we're gonna do in collaboration for the future. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, like you said, this topic is huge.
Yeah.
And, you know, I know for me personally, when I think about sex trafficking, well, generally when I would think about, I'm thinking about some movie or program on television, and it's like, you know, it's fast driving and it's all kinds of stuff going on. And I know there's a lot of myths about sex trafficking. Can you please share a little bit? What's the definition of sex trafficking?
Yes, and so excellent way to start off the conversation. And so I believe definitions are important. And so bear with me because when you hear the definition of trafficking, sometimes people get it mixed up between the difference between human trafficking and sex trafficking. And so sex trafficking is part of the umbrella of human trafficking. So let's break this down first before we get into our discussion. So the definition of trafficking is Trafficking in persons shall mean the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by the means of threat, use of force, abduction, fraud, deception, or the abuse of power, right? In order to benefit or achieve having control over another person. The second part of the definition when we're looking at trafficking too has to deal with exploitation, right? And so when we're thinking about what does exploitation mean, it's really this form of this idea of prostitution, right? And so we're prostituting people either for sexual forces or favors, forced labor or services, slavery, right? And so this is kind of like what we've classified as our modern day slavery and our practices.
Right.
And
Yeah.
or when we're thinking about trafficking too, it can include the removal of organs as well. Right.
Wow.
And so when we're thinking about that is a huge definition of what this is. And this is why so many people in the US and across the broad have been impacted by this crime.
No, thank you so much for really breaking that down, because so much is tied into it than just the taking of it. Like Lucretia was just saying, like it's so much deeper on so many levels. So thank you really for starting off with just really getting into the details of exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so you mentioned like you have stats and stuff. Maybe you can share a little bit of that as well, because, you know, is it mostly people in the United States? Is it people being bought from different countries here? What's going on?
Yeah, so I think that is a great segue as well, because I think a lot of times when people hear about human trafficking and or specifically sex trafficking, you go to movies, right? You go to kind of what you hear in the news. You kind of think it's only happening in countries like Asia or Africa, or some parts of South America, right? And the answer is correct. It is happening there, but it's also happening in our own backyards as well. And so before we get to some of the statistics, there are different just forms of trafficking that I want people to be aware of. But for tonight's conversation, we are going to focus on sex trafficking. But when we hear the term trafficking, there's some examples of forced labor, right? And so people are kind of forced to do work for free. There's organ removal. So depending if you have a good heart or some good lungs, or people want, you know, a hand or a foot, they're selling these kind of things on black markets as well that people have been impacted.
Okay, Dr. Hodge, I just have to ask you, can you please explain a story or something, how this organ trafficking might go? I mean, I don't know any stories, you know.
Yeah, and so most of the organ removal does happen across country, right? And so the same ways when we talk about, when I get later in the discussion on kind of the journey that occurs when people are removed from their homes, typically for organ removals, people are removing their organs in return for financial gain. Right? And so they are kind of meeting people in like these warehouses. They're not having official doctors, right? But somebody that may have gone to some kind of schooling or knows something about the anatomy that can actually get these organs without killing the individual, selling them up on the black market, and then selling these organs for almost multi-million dollars for people that are actually in need of this, but maybe are on the wait list in number 100, right? And so kind of people that are more in like desperate need for these type of organs, that they're going through these black markets. So not going to Kaiser, right? Not going to places like St. Joe's, the county hospital, right? But actually going into kind of these warehouses to receive these types of services.
Wow.
If I could say something, I actually saw a documentary on that, ladies. And exactly like you just said, Candace, these are more like around like different countries, right? Where like they're really poor, they don't have insurance. And it's like, look, my family, my mother, my grandmother needs an organ. We don't have insurance. Like, she's gonna die. And they're literally doing whatever they can to get this organ. And they did like this underground documentary, and they were, you know, interviewing different doctors, and they are making bank off of it. It's like, nope, I don't see it. I don't hear it. Here's the money. Do what you need to do. And they're literally killing people and getting these organs because these people are in dire need of surviving.
Yeah. And for those that are coming from the United States, so like I said, it's mostly being done out of the country. We do have some instances within the US, but majority of US citizens that participate in these types of activities, I would say, right, are going to other countries because they know that it's less likely for them to get caught. And it'll be cheaper to get it coming from the US dollar that usually has a little bit more momentum in comparison to the currency in other countries too, right? But when we talk about some of the statistics too, when we're thinking about specifically sex trafficking, right, it is the third largest criminal enterprise in the world. So number one is drug trafficking. The second one is selling of arms, so purchasing of guns.
Okay.
So after drugs, purchasing of guns, sex trafficking comes in at number 3, in which about 45 million right, individuals have been impacted by sex trafficking. And we're just like, okay, if this many people have been impacted, what is the financial gain, right? And so on average, those who are participating in this make about 150 billion per year, okay? So not per person. So when we're taking all of these cases together, it averages about $150 billion per year. And when we break it down to how much can an individual make for sex trafficking, it's about $3,900 to $34,000 per victim.
Per victim.
$34,000.
And when we get to the 34,000, that's when some of these traffickers and or the buyers have they specify what they want, right? So do they want a teenager? Do they want a virgin? Do they want somebody that's a particular race and or gender, right? And so for depending on what country that you're in, there's going to be certain girls and or boys that fit that criteria where people are willing to pay more for that victim in comparison to less.
And so when I was watching the same documentary, you know, it makes sense of why it's number 3, because you can reuse somebody, right? Like after a drug, you take it, it's gone, you digest it, you're high, you have to go back and get some more, you have to make some more. But when it comes to that human body, you can reuse that human being, which is so sad, from one man to another man to another man to another man, or even a female, right? And it's just really sad. But when I read, or when I watched that documentary and they broke it down that way, and then with the stats right now that you just stated with me, I'm like, okay, now I know why it's number 3.
Yeah.
Because they can reuse something. You can't reuse drugs. And like you said, number 2 was guns, which makes sense. That's why you can reuse a gun, you know, if you have the bullets.
Right.
Yeah. And then when we're thinking about it in terms of like the demographics too, because I know a lot of people are curious and like, okay, is this, you know, a Black problem? Is this a Hispanic problem? Is this a white problem? And it really is everybody's problem, right? And so when we're breaking this down statistically from 2020, they were saying about whites are impacted about 26% of all of the cases. African Americans are about 40. And then when we come to the rest of the demographics, we do see a larger proportion of Asian American communities, which are about 17%.
Okay.
And then as a state of California, we're actually in the world's 5th largest economy when it comes to sex trafficking. The 5th, right? And so it's important for us to talk about this because once again, I think the idea is that this happens somewhere over there, right? But it's actually happening in our homes. And when we start to talk about where these locations are, who's actually being hit, I hope it encourages those who are watching, right? To start having these conversations with their family members, their kids, your clients, right? Because you never know that some of the issues that they may be coming with could be stemmed from a possible trafficking, right? And so for us to kind of just be aware of what's going on, I really do think it's important, particularly because the average age is between 12 and 14, right? And so I have a niece that's 14 years old.
Right.
And so my conversations with her is really just to kind of make sure that she's aware, right? And then understanding what does it mean to have friends, because when we talk about locations and everything in a little bit, we'll kind of see how that actually plays a role. But for California, just in the year of 2020, so from January to October 22nd, excuse me, there have been 518 people arrested. for sex trafficking in the state of California.
Wow. And this is just one state, right? Like, we're not even talking
It's
about
us.
all the other states and what's going on.
Yeah. And so that's kind of just to give you an awareness of kind of who's been impacted, what are the age groups. It's important for us to know that it can hit any and everybody, but there are going to be certain groups of people that are more vulnerable, and we'll talk about that in a little bit.
I think
I have so many feelings. I have so many feelings. Like, it's why I'm just quiet. Like, my heart is just so broken.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
And these young people that are engaged in this too, because even when we've talked about the victimizations of those being 12 to 14, but when we're thinking about the traffickers themselves, they're averaging mid-20s to early 30s.
Right.
That so these are not like the old creepers, right? Another stereotype that we kind of think of a trafficker to be. These are young people that are getting more young people to be involved in this kind of work at early age.
And that kind of reminds me of, the documentary about, what's his name, Epstein, right? And how, these people that, the people that he's using, the 20, 30-year-olds, they're also his victims. But because men like him or women like him, they're manipulating these people. We're like, oh, well, if you get more kids, I'm gonna give you more money, and that's just another form of that control, like you said in the beginning of this conversation, to lure them into that manipulation of getting more individuals.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So Dr. Hodge, you said how like a lot of the traffickers are in their early 20s or mid 20s. What about the people who they're actually, utilizing or actually, having the sex? Do they look a certain kind of way? Are these old, creepy looking men, or is that across the board as well?
It is across the board. And what has been so disheartening, and so my family gets on me with this all the time, because as a normal Candace, right, I am this fun, bubbly type of individual, but the work that I engage with is extremely tough, right? The research that I'm indoctrinated with, it's heartbreaking. But for me, we have to be able to engage in this, because once again, we have to step outside of that notion that only a certain demographic participates. Because if we think that, then we're going to miss all of the victims who could be included. We're going to miss all of those who we think that are trafficked. So of course, yes. So to answer your question, there are some creepy little people that engage, that are buying these services. But in addition to that, we have caught pastors, we have caught people in the military, we have caught law enforcement, judges, politicians, doctors, you name it, teachers, mentors, right? And so we've seen the gamut of that, and that's part of the reason why sex trafficking is hard to prosecute and hard to see, because it's coming from people that we least expect.
Wow.
My goodness. My goodness. And one thing we, when the four of us spoke prior to the show, one thing I mentioned, I think, to Dr. Hodge, is that there was a time where I would hear like a lot of people we have a lot of different conferences here in San Diego. People want to have their conferences here, national conferences, and that a lot of wealthy, older white men who are attending the conferences were really engaged in, soliciting, young girls for sex. For sex. So because of COVID-19, and a lot of things have been shut down, there's a lot of money that San Diego has missed out on because conferences have not taken place here. And I was under the impression, wrongfully so, that it slowed things down in terms of trafficking. Dr. Hodge, you clarified that.
Yeah, and so prior to, so we can talk a little bit before pre-COVID, right? And then I'll talk about how COVID has actually increased the numbers. And so pre-COVID, when we were all about and released into the population, most of the locations that we have seen people being trafficked, particularly when we're looking at teenagers and young people, right? Schools were the primary kind of hotspot, what we call it.
Okay.
So when we're thinking about after school, so when kids are walking home or kids are coming, doing extracurricular activities where they're not being surrounded by guardians per se, right? And they're looking for something to do. They, you know, enjoy talking to other people. That's a way that they've met strangers, right? That could potentially introduce them to these kind of activities. We've seen it happen at community centers. And so for a lot of community centers, a lot of these kids, you know, may come from single parent household. They may come from households that are lacking resources. They may be linked up with, you know, mentors, right? And so with that, you get to begin to talk to people, to let them know your story. And if that person has malintentions, right? That is a perfect opening for them to do so. What we continue to see as a location for trafficking as well are parks, malls, right? And so kind of these open spaces, once again, where majority of the time there's not going to be a parent and or a guardian around, right? And so kids, they don't think like adults, right? They don't think that everybody's going to have ill intentions. We're just out here having fun. You know, we laughing. We don't want to go home yet. But that is a perfect way where people aren't monitored, right? And that we can't figure out who they talk to, who they link up with. And so now, since we have been on lockdown due to COVID-19, what we've noticed is that the numbers have increased through their social media, right? And so we're looking at Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, Vine. And so for most of them, Instagram and Snapchat has been the primary two when we're looking at youth. And so because they're able to, and for most kids, so all of my accounts on my social media are private, right? But I do remember, so before I get to this, I do remember in my undergrad, Facebook had just come out. And so you had to have a student email address to even get on there. Right? And so I remember with Facebook, when it first came out, I was inviting everybody. So anybody from out of state, let's go ahead and be friends. Okay, let's go ahead and meet up. But then I started to delete because I was just like, listen, I'm putting all of my personal information as far as like, if I really had a stalker and somebody wanted to traffic me in undergrad, they would have been totally successful, because the way Facebook was set up is that you put your first and last name, the list of all of your courses, date and times, location.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
My address on there, who my roommates were, right? And so it's like, if you had access to me, you had access to everybody else around me.
Wow.
But what they're doing now is, so there's more protocols that are put in place to keep people safe. But kids aren't using that, right? For the kids, it's more about numbers. So they want to have thousands of followers. They want to get these blue check marks, right? Whereas now we're good with, 40 people that's close to us. I'm fine. So, but for kids, it's like, no, I want to go viral. I want to be known. And so they're going to post a lot more of their information. They're going to post their locations, exactly where they are at all times. And then their profiles are going to be open. And so if that is the case, and I'm looking for a victim, what I'm going to do, scroll down, figure out what you're posting, seeing if you're saying anything, like if you're missing anything in life, like, my parents can't cook. All right. So I might be like, let's go get something to eat. Okay. Right. I can't stand being at home because my parents get on my nerves. Well, let me try to be a friend to you. Right. And then kind of see how that goes. And so with their social media, they're being contacted through their DMs and or their inboxes, right? And so from a parent perspective, the parents are just thinking, hey, my kid's just on their phone talking to their raggedy friends, right? But it could be like, no, they're actually talking to somebody that, one, is grown or has created a profile where you don't know if they're being catfished or not.
Right.
And so if somebody was just like, hey, mom, I'm about to go get coffee with my best friend, Anna, right? They may say that, and when they're going to get the coffee, meeting someone that they met online, and that's a way that they've been caught up, right? And so some of them are kind of like a snatch and grab, but a lot of them are kind of like, I've built relationships with this person. I've built trust with this person. And so they wait till that trust is developed, and then we see a shift later on, and we'll talk about that on how that process kind of moves.
And it's very important, especially as a social worker who, I'm in the homes working with the parents, whether it's parent education or helping them with, the different behaviors that their child is having, right? And too many times what I've seen is that some parents don't have a lot of boundaries, right? With their children. They have so much freedom, these children, where they're in the bathroom with their phones while they're taking their shower, while they're on, going to the bathroom. They sleep with their phones, they're underneath the covers with their phone. And it's like, and I educate these parents because it's like you said, Dr. Hodge, you don't know who is sending what type of pictures. You don't know if they're sending pictures to this person. They're using these fake alias names, these pictures that look like, oh, well, he's a 14-year-old boy, not knowing he's a 50-year-old, 24, whoever. And like you said, like, you don't know what your child is doing, because they're naive, they're young. And like you said, they don't have the mindset that we do. And I think it's very important to really address this, ladies, about the importance of really checking your kids' social media, making sure that you have their passwords. You're making sure, all right, 30 more minutes, you need to give me your phone before you go to bed. And yeah, these kids are going to fuss and fight, but at the end of the day, it's like, I know what's best for you. And I think that parents need to have more control and boundaries to keep their child safe.
And at least conversations about it. You know what I mean? Like not just, I'm going to take your phone, but like have a conversation with your child on why it is important for them to not be on their phone as much, why they need, like, you can't just trust everybody. Me growing up, my mama had to know my friends and parents, where they lived, who their parents hung out with. Like, my mom was thorough. So, and that's not usually how it is nowadays.
No,
it's a lot going on, and I agree. I really think it's about those conversations. Yes, I think children definitely need boundaries, and they know what your expectations are. But at the end of the day, if they're trying to, be sneaky, I mean, kids have dual accounts and different things like that. And I also wanted to say too is that not only are there people out there who are trying to get close to our children and do harm, but it makes me think of a case that I worked with when I was a social worker with Child Welfare Services. And I was working with this young lady who was 20. Long story short, she was being prostituted. The person she was being prostituted by, I guess she believed they were in a relationship. So yeah, he was a pimp and he had many different people he was prostituting, but she was his number one prostitute, for lack of better words.
Right.
Interesting thing is, working with her, found out that when he befriended her, it was like, her and her friends were chilling, and then he pulls up in this nice car, he takes him to the movies, takes him to get something to eat, and it was gradual like that. But the reason why she thought that she was really in is that he took her to meet his mama, his real mama.
Wow.
Mama.
I mean,
the manipulation.
Right? And then at his mama's house, there'd be a lot of people there. But what she found out, that it was a lot of young women there. So it wasn't just the pimp grooming, the mama was grooming.
The madam.
You understand what I'm saying? And so one, she didn't see it coming, as much. But then, like, her mother knew that she had a boyfriend, but they're at his mama's house, and they thought that was a safe zone.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So
wow.
Yeah.
The level of manipulation is
It's sickening. It blows your mind, right? Because when you think about family dynamics, you think about, if I'm gonna meet somebody's mama,
Right. You respect me, I'm in.
Yeah.
Now,
I'm the only, right? But to know that the mom could be in it on too, and maybe housing, right? Supplying.
Right.
Feeding them. This is where you come. This, you can just relax, you chill out here. Mom was grooming them, and I know it was the truth because of the nature of what I do. That it's like we can go back into people's history, so it was already records of that's what this woman was doing for years.
And that's the reason why, and I would love for you, Dr. Hodge, to explain more about the grooming techniques. But, when you have runaway children at the age of 10, 11, 12, because of the emotional or sexual abuse or the dysfunction in their home, and then you come in contact with a man or a woman, right? The madam's like, oh, you need food? Like you said, you need shelter? Wow, we're a loving family. you know that's what they are looking for because they didn't even have it in their own home. And then, like you said, Lucretia, that's how they lure them in.
Mm-hmm.
And so, speaking of, right, grooming techniques, it always starts when we're looking for a vulnerability, right? And so we're looking for what that specific individual is missing, and then I need to become the answer to that,
Right.
right? And so, you know, what are some general causes of vulnerabilities? Because it's a long list, right? And so it could be shelter. And so a lot of people could have lost their homes. A lot of people could have been displaced. COVID-19 has shifted America, right? And so there's been resources that a lot of people, young people and families are yearning for. And so if I still have it and if I'm in a good position, I can offer that to you, right? And so that could be my way in. It could be simple as food, right? And
right there.
You know, even for young people now, they have been used to getting foods at their schools, their lunches, right? Since COVID has happened, maybe their parents can't cook 3 meals a day. Maybe their parents have been dependent on those meals that their kids were getting for breakfast and lunch. And so since they're missing that, you know, just even taking them to In-N-Out, right? Could be the highlight for their day. So for you as a parent and as an adult, you just like, nobody want that, right? But your kids, right, will flock to that because that could be something that they're missing. Unemployment is another way that people are able to get in. So when we're thinking about social media, a lot of those times could be modeling agencies, right? And so we've kind of seen famous. Yeah, Insta famous for like modeling. And so, you know, that can be a way in. Or, you know, some of these little side hustles that don't have money on the books are just like, all right, well, if Amazon ain't hiring, go ahead and hook me up. And then I can get some money to kind of feed myself or sustain. Money has been a big issue for a lot of them, right? And so even just to pay bills, to pay tuition. And so I've seen people that we would think on the outside is good, but it has gone into sex trafficking because they need to pay off their student loans, right? And so money can be like a big factor. And there was actually a case where it was a lawyer based out of New York who fell underneath this. And so he was like in his late 20s, but because he came out of law school with almost $100,000 in debt, there was no job. So he's still a lawyer, a current practicing lawyer, but it's also involved in prostitution to pay for his debt. Right. So it's not only impacting people that come from, you know, maybe low income neighborhoods, it's affecting middle and upper class. And we'll get to examples with that too. But when we're hitting kind of this middle and upper class sector, there's kind of this term that's called helicopter parents, right? And so parents that are kind of like just all over their kids, like they have to be the best in school, they have to be in all of these different types of sports, they have to kind of be perfect, right? And so sometimes students look for opportunities, or kids look for opportunities to be free, right? To kind of mess up a little bit because they've always had to be perfect. And so if they want to do that, that can also lead them into circles, right? That may not be the best, that can lead them to that. Boredom is another kind of cause for people, and particularly now during COVID-19. Like, I'm tired of all the Zoom calls for my school. You know, I'm stuck in the house all day. Like, I'm looking for something exciting. Like, even for me, it gets to the point, like, I get excited just to walk outside. Never had done that before, right? But it's because it's like this journey that I need to get out and do something. If you're not in the proper mindset, you're going to link up with somebody that may lead you to something that you're not supposed to be in, which could be trafficking.
One thing that you said that you brought up beforehand is how the predator uses certain words. So like you said, like, you know, I'm bored. Let's just say they're on Facebook, or they post something on Instagram, like, man, I'm so bored. Like, I just want to get out. And then if the predator's like, oh, well, why don't you go to this park? Knowing that the child or the teen's gonna be like, well, I live at this park. You know what I mean? So like you were just saying, like, they know certain words, knowing that they're going to get a certain answer to know where they live to bring them out the house. And again, because you're a child, you're not going to know those signs.
Yeah. And then it's kind of like when we think about outside of just some of those techniques, because it's like I said, it could be hundreds of reasons why people are vulnerable to certain ways, you
Right.
have to look at who is a potential trafficker,
Hmm.
right? And so we have the traditional stranger. So the
Mhm.
whole snatch and grab, I see you on the street, I want to take you, boom, there you go. That is
Right.
a reality, right? But that is not always the reality.
Right.
We talked about it earlier when it comes to intimate partners, right? So it may start off that I think that I'm in this relationship with this man,
Yes.
right? And then we're doing something good, like I'm falling in love with him. And then all of a sudden he was just like, babe, you should come move in with me. All right, I'm moving in with you. Then as we're moving in, he wants to give the story like now he's having financial troubles.
Wow.
And in order for us to pay these bills, I know a place where you can maybe start stripping. And then at that strip place, then I maybe know some people, baby, if you love me, we really need to get this money. I don't mind if you sleep with so-and-so, let's go ahead and help out. Boom. Because she loves this individual, even though she may not want it, she's going to do it because now she trusts him. Now she's living with him. Now she's
Wow.
friends and family, right? And so it can be people that we consider our intimate partners, or it can be our own family members.
Yep.
Right? That have sold us into it where it was parents. And so there's this one example, and she was a Caucasian woman where her mom and dad sold her in order for them to pay their mortgage.
Oh my goodness.
Right?
Here in America.
She was 8 years old when she was trafficked.
What?
Right? And so it can be your own people that do that to you. Right? Because there's a need, there's a vulnerability that they're trying to void. So she wasn't out on the streets, ripping and running with the wrong crowd. It was her parents that said, hey, we need to do this. And she actually did it for about 20 years, even when she was married and had her own kids. Her husband didn't know what she was going out to doing on the weekend. She was just like, babe, I got to work, these full shifts. I'll be back. Right. And it wasn't until they were like in year 5 or 6 of their marriage that he was just like, something's not right, right? And what's going on? And she finally came forward. But she mentioned that she didn't say anything because, once again, the traffickers threatened her family, right? And said that if you were to run and or to leave, I'm killing your husband and your 2 boys, right? And so
I'm glad you... Oh.
Go ahead, Wulanda.
No, continue. No, continue.
And so just like, as a mother, you want to make sure that you're protecting your family. But once again, that's an idea that we're not thinking about. It's not only coming from strangers. And then right before I get to Wulanda's point, it's friends, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we're thinking about some of these kids, it's who they're being befriended to, right? So these are classmates. And so even when Marincia talked about earlier, Jeffrey Epstein, a lot of them, so Jeffrey Epstein might have done the initial trafficking, but as soon as he got one girl, he's like, hey, if you go out and get another girl, I'll pay you $100 for that. And the more girls that you get $100 for each girl you bring. Right. She's bringing people that she had in class.
I know. Yeah.
Right? And so that's kind of the connection when we're talking about who can be trafficked. It can come from a variety of different people.
Right.
My mind this is so emotional. It's so heavy, and I'm struggling.
Yeah.
And just the stereotypes that you're breaking down, and not just not just with class or with race, but people that are actually active in trafficking as an adult. Mm-hmm. And because I was thinking, oh, traffic, like you get snatched, you're no longer connected to your family. Right. Like all that stuff is gone. And you're telling me about lawyers who have everyday jobs and suburban housewives or wives that, have husbands and children. And the extent of this atrocity is just bananas to me. Like it's so heartbreaking.
And pointing back to that, I really want to make sure that I talk about this story. And so there's a lady that's named Tony D. Riviera. And so she's been doing kind of talks across the land for the last few years, and she's really in on this human trafficking. But she gave her story, trying to do it as short as I can, but I think she was like 14 years old. She's from the South, and where her sex trafficking came up is when she actually went to Freaknik, right? And so Freaknik, for those who maybe don't know what that is kind of a wild...
For Gen Z.
a wild week of events, okay? A lot of sex, a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol, music is supposed to be there. But that's where she came from. So as a young 14-year-old, she's surrounded by all these grown people that's looking for sex, right? And that's kind of where it started for her. She was dancing on top of a car, and people started throwing money on her, and her friends came down with $20 or something, right? So with no money and left with a lot of money. And
Wow.
so the guy that actually started to traffic her saw that she was like enthralled with all this money and was just like, hey, I can get you a lot more than this if you come with me, right? And so she was actually able to go back home and then leave on the weekends for her. So once again, it's not always like I have to be removed totally.
Right.
Like these people are still going to school, still having jobs, right? Still living with their families. But what was really fascinating about Toni is when we talk about the different types of traffickers, what really blew my mind. And so I am a Christian and y'all are Christians too.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, heavy church goer, you know, born and raised in Church of God in Christ. But what she said in her story that totally just made me sink. And so part of her recruitment was in the church.
Wow.
And so she mentioned how like on every first and third Sunday she would go, because one, that was the Sunday where they had the most people in the congregation, right? And so what she would do specifically, she would wait for altar call to see who went up to altar call, because then, ding, 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 I see a vulnerability, and particularly if they're young, I'm now going to become mentors.
That's scary. That's scary.
Right? And that's how she got a lot of the girls to be trafficked with her. You know, she went to some kind of college, I think in North Carolina or somewhere around that line, where she wasn't a student and pledged Delta Sigma Theta, right? And was able to traffic them through that organization, and not even being a student, but she was able to pledge and cross over and do all of those things. Once again, trying to find out how can I get people where I'm under the radar, because we're always looking for these creepy men, right? And never thinking how women can play that role as well.
Right. My goodness.
It's dangerous. It's so dangerous on so many levels, Dr. Hodge.
And that, Dr. Hodge, makes me think of, you know, not just the conversations about trafficking, but those vulnerabilities. Like you have said that repeatedly. Like we all are broken people. We all, you know, have our things that we are lacking, but being able to feed your child their emotional and spiritual selves. Now, you don't have to be a Christian. Whatever you do is what you do. But that vulnerability, like teach them how to get that fed and not rely on someone else to do it, because that is the trap. That's the trap.
Yeah, and that deals with upbringing, and particularly for those that may feel like they've come from disadvantaged backgrounds. And so I know when I was growing up, what was really important with my parents is that my dad showed me what love looked like from a man, right? And so
healthy,
doing that, right? When I started to date, I wasn't really too pressed that if you open my door, because I'm like, you're supposed to do that, right? Or if you paying for the meal, I'm like, all right, thank you, you know. But it wasn't like if I've never had that as training. If a guy opened my door, I'd be like, oh, girl, guess what? He opened my door. You know, I'm just feeling like he loves me. And it's just like, no, like you need to kind of do those things and kind of prepare yourself on what healthy looks like, what a healthy relationship looks like, what love looks like, what are some of the warning signs. And if you start to see warning signs, how you can try to figure out how to leave, right? And so it's about that education, like you said, allowing kids to be kids. Yeah. Right. There's going to be different stages where you introduce stuff. So we're not saying introduce this stuff to kids 2 years old, right? But understanding, you know, that we're going to teach them boundaries at different stages, and as they get older, we're going to be a little bit more transparent, right? Because we have to. Because if we don't teach our community, the world is going to teach, right?
Absolutely.
And that's not always going to be the best scenario.
Dr. Hodge, you as you were talking about like having your dad in your life and showing you what love, healthy love looks like from a father and a male perspective, you know, there's a lot of things that you didn't fall prey to. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about just in terms of when we're raising our children from little ones on up, something that we were talking about is how, like, culturally speaking, you know, when you walk into a home, and there's an elder there, you know, you go to them, you greet them. Oftentimes, at least in my family, You give them your grandparents a kiss and a hug, and give me the baby, and they hold the baby and things like that. I'm not saying anything is wrong with that overall, but my daughter, when we were, raising her, she's 14 now, but we were really, really keen on teaching her what boundaries were and are. And so even when she was a toddler, so basically as a child, we wouldn't walk into a home and hand her to people that we love and we know who loved her. It was like once she's comfortable, if she reaches for you and whatever, it's a gradual thing. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And people learned early on, that we consider our village, that this is how we roll, and they respected that. And so, we just never said you have to kiss this person or hug this person. We cut out like sitting on laps at an early age. And it was just, and we talked to her about boundaries. Yeah. And protecting herself. And so she grew up being very comfortable with that. And people grew up, got to know her and watch her grow up and respected her boundaries. That was never an issue. So I'm just thinking about just some things that we're accustomed to doing. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to continue doing it, or we can teach some healthy things around that.
I think that is excellent. And what I admire because what I'm hearing is that one, you communicated what you were going to do with your child. Right. And so I think that allows people to kind of have that level of expectation that when you come over, this is how I interact with you and your family. Right. And so sometimes people are afraid to have these conversations. And so it's kind of like when you get to the family function and you just like, my baby ain't about to go over there. They think you stuck up or snotty. Right. But it's like, no, I want to teach them boundaries. And so, yes, I do think boundaries are extremely important. And I think it gives the message that you have autonomy to what happens to you and your body. Right. And so
talk about that.
When we talk about, because it's about consent the whole way.
Yes.
So we teach about consent. So consent is an active word, right? And so just because when I came over, for the 4th of July and gave you a hug and kiss, don't mean when I come over for Thanksgiving, that's
exactly
how I feel, right?
Yeah.
So I think as parents too, I think, old school ideologies, we just didn't want people to think that we were rude coming into their house. But then I think when we force kids, we force ourselves to do stuff that we don't want to do, that's going to trickle down to when we start to engage in these relationships where we're afraid to say no, right? Because we've been trained not to do that because that's rude. So even if something makes us uncomfortable,
important.
It's important for us to allow kids at a young age to know, what they're comfortable with. And so it's like if I be like, come here, and the kid's like, and I'm like, all right, I'll deal with you later, right? I don't want that parent to force that kid on me because once again, it's showing that we're not respecting kind of what they're feeling at the moment.
So good. So good.
And again, it's breaking what the tradition was, you know what I mean? And it doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but like you said as well, Lucretia, I mean, you ladies know I have a 2-year-old and she's always been the type like, let me fill you out first. And I love that about her,
Smart.
Like, if that's how you are, Isabella, and I don't care if you grandma, grandpa, papa, uncle, whoever, my daughter's like this. Like you said, give her time. She'll fill you out and she'll give you a hug. And my thing's like, and I believe you said this before, Lucretia, if she says hi, I'm good with that. Like that extra hug and kiss, it will come if she feels like it. And again, even though she's about to be 2, it's important to talk about boundaries and respect at this age. You don't wait till she's 14, 15 years old and she's about to date now. Like you said, Dr. Hodge.
Yeah. And her also being able to trust herself. Like she's learning, you're teaching her how to trust your instinct. Go with your instinct. What you're telling yourself is true.
And then opening that door to if there's ever a moment where there's been some interactions that has made you feel uncomfortable, to make sure that you feel comfortable talking to us, right? Because in my research world, right, there's a word that's called a dark figure. So we know that there's millions of people who've been impacted, right? But there could be another number of people who are impacted who haven't come forward for a variety of different reasons, right? So it's because they're scared of maybe who their trafficker is. They never really been taught on kind of what is appropriate touching or talking or discussions. Based on kind of what you see in the news and the media, some of these things might be considered normal. right? And so they haven't been taught that these are kind of the normal ways to interact, the normal ways to engage in sex, the normal ways to have a healthy relationship. And so if we're listening to rap music, movies, right, documentaries, they might show more of aggressive side to what should be valued. And so they might think that that's okay. And so kind of just like you said, as kids are aging, right, figuring out just appropriate techniques. And so when we're dealing with kids too, sometimes, we may talk about these things when it comes to dolls, right? And so just kind of showing them on the doll, what is appropriate areas. And if you feel uncomfortable in this area, you raise your hand. That's who you can talk to, right? And then as people get older, then you can get a little bit more transparent.
And one thing you said, Dr. Hodge, I really like it, and I think I'm going to use it. What you said, you might see somebody on the 4th of July, and you okay with hugging, and Thanksgiving you're not. I think that's really important too, because I think oftentimes not only adults but young people find themselves in situations because maybe they were disobedient to their parents, they stayed out later, they went over so-and-so's house they weren't supposed to, and all these different things. And because they did something they weren't supposed to and got caught up in a situation, then they use it on themselves to not speak up and say what's going on. And so again, it's letting them know, like, yes, just because you said you did something once or you find yourself in a situation, call mama, call dad, call uncle, call whatever. You still have a right to say no the next time. I don't go, I think it's real important.
So good.
And one last thing that I will say before we wrap up, ladies, is also, really observe your child's behaviors.
Right.
So even if you've noticed that she's more like this towards one person than the other, or she's like squirmy all the time, look at that. Like, look at that as a sign. Like, I think with me, I'm even more hyper vigilant because I'm a social worker, I'm a therapist, I'm a mother. I've always been like, my radar's always been up. Thank the Lord, I've never been, abused sexually or physically or anything. So I'm always like, okay, Bella, like, you good? Like, even though I know she's good, I'm always just like, but even like that. And I would rather be like how I am now to keep my daughter safe and my other children safe than to be naive and just think, oh, just because that's your so-and-so and so-and-so. No.
And you mentioned that, and I wanted to make sure that we briefly talked about that before we got off, is when we talk about warning signs, right? Yeah. And so you mentioned the first one that I had is like changes in behavior. And so it's not only changes in behavior with the interaction, but if you have a kid that was like a straight A and B student, right? And then all of a sudden is failing now, right? We may need to pay attention to what's going on there. If they're constantly on their phones and every time you go in the room, they putting it down.
Okay.
Or go somewhere else. Like you said, being in the bathroom for hours and don't take all that, right? To go use the bathroom. Those could be signs that they may be engaging in conversations or viewing something, right? That could lead them to go further. Sneaking out, sleeping more, having nightmares. Like, a lot of these things are triggered by something. And so
even wet in the bed too, Dr. Hodge.
Yes, wet in the bed, that's a signifier of being fearful.
Yeah.
Right? And not being able to control kind of how your body operates in that way. And so other than warning signs from behavior aspects, right? Social media has also taught us some warning signs that we should be privy to when we're out and about. And so my main one that I kind of want to talk to about, since we only just have a couple more minutes left, one is called the honey tactic. And so it has gone viral on TikTok. And so TikTok is another kind of social media that kids are always on. And so what the honey tactic is that some traffickers have put regular honey, right? So uncapping the top, putting it on your car in between where your front door is. And so if you try to take it off, it releases all the honey to make your car sticky, where it's hard for you to get in. That's a way that they can distract you and that they traffic people, right? The flyers on your front car. So sometimes we'll get flyers on our windshield. We want to look at it and read it. Let the wind blow that thing off.
Yep, I will litter for that.
Okay. Let that thing just go ahead and blow off. What we've seen also when it comes to like your homes is that they put recorders right outside of people's doors of like a baby crying. Right. And so we might ignore people fussing outside. Right. But if I hear a baby crying, I'm going to go outside and see what's going on. right? And that's a way to kind of ambush to get in, do what they need to do, and then nobody sees it, right? And so just making sure that when you are out and about, I don't want you to be fearful, but I want you to be
aware.
Right. And so not walking around with your phone, your hand, your head hanging down, not paying attention, because that is a good way to get you off track.
Yeah.
And so those are just some kind of warning signs that I wanted people to kind of just be privy to, because traffickers are finding new and creative ways to get people other than always just the snatch and grab.
Ooh, this was so good.
I have more questions for you offline, because I'm trying to figure out this other side. Like, what is the pattern with these traffickers? Like, did your mom not hold you enough? Like, what is it?
It's a variety of things. So yes, that could be it, right? A lot of them, for their traffickers, they're trying to provide for their family. So when we're thinking about traffickers, they're not always these, what my mom calls these people, like just in the basement, in their mama's basement, lonely, right? And so these are people these are people that have an education. These are people that have families, that are married with kids, right? But are trying to find a way to survive that is outside of their 9 to 5, maybe getting paid a few $100s a week or a couple thousand a month, living in California. Y'all know that may not always be the same. Okay?
Right.
And so, if you hear that this industry makes $150 billion a year, and I can make 3,000 up to 34,000 per victim.
This is a person.
I know.
Yeah. To us, we know that. And then part of the reason why there's so many is because prosecution is extremely low. And so we've seen traffickers get away with it for a fine. We've seen, there was actually one trafficker that was in India. He trafficked 1,000 girls. 3 years in prison. 3, right? And so it's like, if I only get 3 and I get out, I still got my life to live. So
our family's set.
Yeah.
And then also too, one last thing too, Dr. Hodge, is like, how many times, and even ladies as well, how many times do we see it's the prostitute or it's the victim that gets sentenced and not even the
always arrested? Yeah, they're always the ones that are arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced way before the trafficker and or the Johns that buy these exchanges.
It's patriarch society.
Yeah, some work to do. My goodness.
And so I know before we leave, one thing I want to let the viewers know is that resources are available. And so I did send the panel a link of resources for a variety of different ways. So if you're interested in just learning more about human trafficking, if you've been trafficked or a victim and or survivor yourself, some of these other websites that can kind of help you that are for free. So for those that are wondering about resources, there are plenty out there. So make sure that you go and check that out.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was so good.
Absolutely. And so like Dr. Hodge says, she has a link with some great resources, and we'll be providing like resources as well that you can tap into. And just one resource in particular that pertains to what we're talking about right now is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And you don't have to remember the number. You can go to the site or you can just Google it. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline is 1-888-373-7888. We hope that we said something that can be of help. And be safe out there.
Please.
And again, we will be writing all of the resources, or not all of them, but majority of them in the comment section. And again, our show is recorded. So again, please feel free to comment and, send us any questions that you may have. Again, we'll have the resources. We also have an email address that you have any concerns or issues or anything, please feel free to reach out to us.
And our Facebook page.
Thank you all so much, Walanda.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is great.
Thank you. This
Very
is
informative.
Thank you.
Keep doing what you all are doing.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you. I will. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.